Good evening, Sujit, and welcome to Design Dialogues hosted by Rethinking the Future in collaboration with Fublis. This is your host, Bhavya, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Sujit, the visionary founder and principal architect of SDEG in Bangalore. Just to give a brief introduction about your studio, Sujit Nair Design Group, founded in 2007 in Bangalore, is a dynamic architectural practice known for its experimental approach to design. Focused on exploring the intersections of urban flows, culture, politics, and other social economic shifts, SDEG creates architecture that responds to contemporary challenges and transformation. With the flexible and evolving design philosophy, the firm embraces a mix of attitudes, technologies, and techniques to create innovative solutions that reflect the complexity of modern urban life. So, thank you so much for joining us today, Sujit.
Thank you, Bhavya. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to talking to you.
So, before starting the questions, I would like to inform you that this interview will be published on the website of Fublis. So, sign up on the Fublis website and you'll get the access to watch this interview. So, shall we proceed with the questions?
Sure. Yeah.
So, first question for the day. Your firm's philosophy embraces the idea of adapting swiftly to urban transformations. Could you share how this approach has influenced a recent project of yours and the unique strategies that emerged as a result?
So I want to first sort of step back and kind of define to you what it means by us saying that urban transformations have a big impact on the way we think about buildings and the envelope. For us, urban transformations essentially means a sort of tension that happens between the context of the site and the building itself, even before it begins. And it's that tension that we sort of work with through the diagramming and conceptual stages. Now, this leads to a sense of dynamism and a kind of interaction between the building and the street or the neighborhood. Now, a project that we did recently was a competition, and we won that competition. It's called the Metha Square in Ernakulam. Very, very important intersection. And the brief really included for the entire building. Metha Square essentially is an old commercial project. It's been around for, I think, over 30, 40 years, is in desperate need of renovation, repairs. The client there is a celebrated, politician, also a very celebrated family, and they have this sort of desire now to have the building improved, and they also want to give back to the city. So it has a slight, let's say, an urban angle to it, apart from the building itself needing complete overhaul. It's in this light that we participate in the competition. It was an open competition, of course, and I think our idea of breathing life into it was to extend the scope of the project to just beyond the edge of the building and also look at the space at the foreground of the project. And I think that's what we mean by us using the idea of urban transformations to actually increase even the scope of a project and not just sort of restrict its emergence in purely built context. So we're now looking at ways to completely redo the facade using a sustainable technique. We're looking at cross-laminated timber. We're also looking at the setbacks that the building has currently and seeing whether we can completely remove the boundary and give it back to the city, have artists come over and engage with the project. Certain parts of the building will be dedicated to art for the city. Completely look at a fresh look at how hawkers will use the space, look at street furniture, greater interaction with the train station right opposite. There's a lot of opportunity. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, that's just one project. But, even when we're sort of bound to a much tighter site, we did a hospital a few years ago in Bangalore, and that's another project where we looked at, after fitting in all the program, a very dense sort of internal volume. And we try to liberate the facade by removing as much of it as possible after taking out of all the services, sort of negating all the services, and the shape that we got out of it really became the public frontage of the project. So the waiting areas and so on really sat in the front of the building, the elevation. You see people when you pass by, which is kind of unconventional when you look at a hospital project. And for us, I think it's really that interaction with the city at large right in front, wherever it provides us the opportunity to kind of affect the building, we're excited about it. It's a long answer to a short question, but yeah, I mean, I just wanted to kind of put that in context.
Your studio envisioned Project 113 as a neutral environment for creative thinking. Could you explain on how the design and material choices such as concrete, lime, plaster, and steel support this vision of neutrality and creativity?
I think so. When you're doing your own space, 113 is our office, by the way. I'm sitting here right now. It's a big decision in many ways. It's almost the culmination of many years of practice to kind of find the confidence to do your own space. It also ends up becoming the most sort of difficult project. And it's at this point, I think, as a team, we decide to step back and reflect by really looking at all the work we've done until then and to see whether we can find this analogy that you can carve, sculpt, and create in a completely neutral shed. Think of a sculptor who works out of his workshop. Think of a painter who works out of his gallery or his the space in his house. They are essentially neutral spaces. But the work that comes out of the canvas, and in canvas I mean now two ways. The canvas is neutral because you're working out of it, and the canvas you draw on is another kind of canvas. And that's the kind of analogy we use here. We said that we should look at the canvas we operate out of as a neutral environment, allowing us to then not be influenced and not have this sort of overpowering ambience that will in any way affect the way or sort of disrupt or interfere or distract our daily sort of life here. We're here for many hours, like most studios. And I think it was that sort of drove this whole process. So the choice of materials really, we tried to bring it down to a bare minimum, as a material palette. And we want to look at the interactions of these three or four materials. So we'll really try to work out different permutations and combinations and how these materials met, the junctions and intersections became the project really. So there's glass, there's steel, there's repurposed wood in some areas, and there's, of course, concrete. Concrete, of course, for us, and I think for most designers, continues to sort of behave and express itself as the most neutral material when it is eventually finished. And our building is extensively finished in concrete. And we've intentionally sort of looked at the many frames within the space and looked at composing those. So when we were working through the plan, we were really trying to imagine ourselves weaving through the space on a day-to-day basis, looked at the many ways we would occupy it through the working day, and to see how we can really bring in a sense of seriousness in the workspace, a kind of a liberated environment because it's all primarily open. And then there are sort of nooks and corners here where people can kind of take refuge through the day and find some relief from what they're doing at their desk. So it's really that. I think the palette allows us to do that. There are just sort of occasional splashes of red, and that was done only for minimal distraction. To kind of when your eyes are wandering, you want it to sort of be locked at some moment in the office that allows you that breather. So it's really that we've strategized it like that. I'd love to kind of confidently say that everyone's happy here. And I see us being here for a while. You build this for the next 40, 50 years typically, and you don't want a sense of fatigue to creep in. And it was important for us to look at the space like that at the outset.
So, as you just mentioned, that this project 113 is your own office. If I may ask, what is the intent behind the name 113 and how did the design process differ from typical other project of yours? And were there any unexpected challenges in balancing functional needs with personal architectural principles of yours?
113 simple. It's the address, and that just became colloquially we kept calling it 113 through construction. We assign a little code or a little number or an abbreviation to every project. This one was 113 through construction and design, and the name just stuck. So we call the building 113. I think, going back to my earlier answer on this, it was important for us to see whether we could detach and disconnect ourselves from the work we do otherwise for our other projects. The functionality of it is obviously very crucial because we're functioning as architects in this space. And to be able to, at that moment, solve, program, and then give it shape as architecture, I think we've managed to kind of look at it like that separately, to kind of say that we sort of open-ended about solving the program in some sense so that we can kind of live into the space and I think that's very important when you're in an office for a length of time, is to create enough neutrality within it to be able to grow into it as well. And we've done that, I think, by just keeping it as bare as possible and not over customizing it in any way for our current needs. I think we'll be able to sort of grow into it through the course of time. So I think that's how we've looked at it functionally, with a sense of open-endedness. I don't know if that sort of answered your question
It
specifically.
did, it did, it does
Yeah.
actually. So, as previously mentioned in my introduction, also, SDEG emphasizes on architecture of overlapping attitudes, technologies, and techniques. Could you elaborate on how these overlapping methods come together in your design process, especially when handling diverse and challenging projects?
Yeah, so I think the way we look at our projects is there are some constants in the design process as we look to conceptualize at the early stages. So I think for us, some things are non-negotiables, the way we solve program, for example. So the early stages of a project typically go through a fairly rigorous breaking down of the functional aspects of a project. And I look at functionality in essentially two parts. One is a kind of static functional aspect of a project, which really does not a lot of scope to maneuver and manipulate. But every project, and we try and kind of identify a percentage for it. So let's say about 30 to 40% of the program really has to kind of get locked in, because those are really crucial functional aspects. They come from the kind of client's lifestyle, if it's a residential project, or it comes from a kind of clear um, interaction of spaces, if it's an institutional project, for example. Those are the sort of more standardized aspects of a project. Let's use that term. But there's another part of the project which we think becomes the more dynamic part of the project. And it's that interaction between the static and the non-static part of a project that really excites us. We're interested in this idea of creating a tension between, let's say, the circulation and the movement through a building versus the parts of the building that really are occupied for more hours or more time. And I think if you look at all our projects, this is how we kind of imagine the initial setup of the building. And I think that that's something that stayed with us through time, even through our early work and maybe some of the projects that we might discuss later in this conversation, is that what part of the project offers us that opportunity to break down functionally to create this sort of interesting relationship between, let's say, circulation and the fixed programming. The second thing is, I think, we really believe that there's a certain opportunity or there's a certain latency within the project. There's something that the project wants to do as well. And over time, I think we've gotten better and better at kind of deciding that, and not to kind of impose a certain language, style, or a set of processes that might take away what the project wants to do. We really think that the project itself has an aspiration onto which we load our aspirations. And I think that's important as well for us.
Moving on to another project of yours, given Shipara's tight urban site, what strategies did you employ to optimize natural light and ventilation, particularly with the surrounding buildings on three sides?
Shipara was really interesting that way. It's on I think about 100 or 110 square meter site. And what we've done there is, again, kind of deconstructing this program to see whether we can reconfigure this idea of the relationship between the management and staff areas. So while the brief typically is for an office space to create that segregation, we are saying that yes, we will create that segregation for you, but it doesn't have to be through hard boundaries, and it doesn't have to be through partitioning, and it doesn't have to be sort of floor wise like you typically do. You don't have to stack up. And so what we've done intentionally to sort of break the flat floor slab into a series of stacked mezzanines and no longer just sort of complete slabs. And what that does is it basically completely takes away the edges of the slab. So from the management area, they're able to overlook the staff areas and vice versa. So in some sense, it breaks down those relationships as well and creates a new sort of choreography within the space. And also the user, as they're navigating the space, is looking at much more than what's immediately around them. They're looking at a lot more through the building. Actually, there are parts of Shipara where you can stand at the edge of the building inside and look all the way to the back, to the rear edge of the building. And to be able to sort of achieve that within that tight building was very interesting for us. And that really involved positioning the core and services, etc., very strategically. The second aspect of it, of course, was bringing in light. And we've positioned the windows and the facade very carefully. They come from this search for what to look at on the outside and also to kind of make sure that it draws the right light because it is also facing the east to kind of ensure that it brings in the right kind of light at the right time of the day. So those windows there are positioned sometimes as double height, sometimes they're much smaller windows. We stayed away from doing this complete kind of curtain glazing that you typically encounter with a commercial office building. So most of the light actually surges through the space, and the fact that there are no edges and there are not too many walls inside that small space, the light kind of seeps through to almost 2/3 of that floor plate. The rare part of the building where light doesn't really touch as clearly, we've managed to create a light well, and light bursts down through the top, really through to the back sides, and that's where the cabins are, that's where the bosses are sitting. We didn't want them to sit there, but Vastu was a big criterion in this case. So they get their light through a light well essentially, and it doesn't take away too much area from the floor plate as well. So it's that mix of top lighting and the front glazing and kind of freeing up the floor plate that allows for light and ventilation to come through the project.
So in Shipara, the circulation spiral was one of the key elements in the design. Could you elaborate on how it enhances connectivity between spaces and its impact on the building's overall spatial experience?
Yeah, I think so once we've located the core, firstly, I just want to step back and say that we normally also try not to kind of place the program specifically in allocated areas at the very outset. There's this kind of dialogue between the overall massing and volume of the project and how that might impact the flow plate as well. We don't draw up necessarily plans first and then try and extrude to see what's left over. At least in most projects, we're allowed that we're able to find that process coming through. So here as well, we figured out a way to compact the core as much as possible and place it in such a way that we were able to demarcate these two specific areas, as I was mentioning before, the more private side, which is where the management would sit, and the front side, which is mostly kind of open office accounts and HR and working staff and so on. Now, I think by doing that, it basically means that there's no structure in the rest of the flow plate. The structure is limited to just the core. It acts as the structural anchor. And that's a diagram that we've carried forward to other projects as well later on. And the rest of the structure is really tied to just the periphery of the building. So everything else is then just concealed. Which then means that as you're sort of spiraling through the building, you're not only navigating, you don't at any point feel that you're only on a circulation path. You just realize that you're actually navigating program at many places. So there are very few cabins. So sometimes you're actually walking through the middle of the accounting space without actually disturbing them. It means that the circulation almost becomes part of the program in some areas where it's allowed to, and in some areas where it's not allowed to, it becomes a passage. So the spiraling then becomes this sort of experience that you 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 almost discover. It's a path of discovery as you go through the building, and there's no dull moment. Even though it's essentially again all concrete, but just the sort of spatial differentiation that happens as you move around the building, and you're never kind of covering more than half a flight, so there's no fatigue as well as you climb up. It makes for interesting navigation. I still go there. The project was done, I think, over 10 years ago. And I'm always using the steps there. I never use the elevator, although they have an elevator inside as well. And I like to do that simply because I don't know what I'm going to encounter next. And that's what that spiral affords you. It's almost a kind of journey through the building.
So, talking about the same project, Shipara, the base recessed and the art design lends to a very unique and a purge appearance to the project. Could you share the inspiration and intent behind this choice and how it fits within the building's broader architectural narrative?
Yeah, I think the relationship of the building to the ground is very important for us. Shipara essentially starts at about 1.5 floors, and that's because the sort of split mezzanine. It starts at 1.5 floors from the ground, and it becomes important for the building to land onto the ground gracefully. That's one aspect of it. And the second thing is to kind of ensure that that volume below the building belongs to the building rather than it being part of the street or unused or sort of doesn't participate in the rest of the project. By making sure that the structure of the project, and we also didn't want it to be too close to the front, the structure, so we've kind of figured out with our structural engineer to ensure that the building sort of springs off or cantilevers off the rear part of the project. And in doing so, it needed that arch for a supporting system, but it also worked out well for us to kind of ensure that it had that springing sort of feel. And if you look at Shipara as this idea of it being a sculpted object in that on that street, it works well because it no longer feels like it's disconnected from the ground plane. It means that the ground plane almost meets the building gracefully. It sort of weaves itself down and anchors itself to the ground. And it's that anchorage that the arched base implies in some sense. So it's got a slightly metaphorical aspect to it. And in fact, it also has a structural implication. So it's us, we kind of resolving that in some sense and then creating, this sort of grace for the project and kind of making sure it has that sprung effect off the ground.
Could you share insights into your studio SDEG's approach to sustainable design within the rapidly increasing urbanizing context of your regions that you serve, and any specific technologies you prioritize for efficiency and resilience?
Well, sustainability is something that we're looking at very closely in the office. I can't say we have really been successful with it yet, but I think we're grappling with it in many ways. I have a take on it though, which is to say that if you were to look at a building running like an engine made of many parts that consume very little energy, that's also sustainability, but it also means that you're consuming a significant amount of energy first and then trying to sort of ensure that it consumes less energy over a period of time. I'm implying, the IGBC rating and the LEED rating and so on. So we are doing projects that are rated, but I'm not fully convinced that's necessarily what sustainability implies. It's become that way. And I have to also defensively say that we are an urban practice. It means that you get projects of all kinds. And when you're doing larger projects for housing and so on, and the client expresses a desire to consume less post his exit, you unfortunately have to invest significant amounts at the upfront to then achieve those numbers and so on. But if you were to really look at building sustainably, that's a different science altogether. And we are doing small projects like that. Let's say we're doing a small farmhouse in a remote area of the Ingni, for example, where we're using mud block. We're trying to sort of figure out a way to build by consuming less. But I think sustainability also in many ways has something to do with aging well. And I sense sometimes that the way we look at sustainability, there's a kind of rudimentary aspect to it, which I am not fully aligned to. I think it's important that buildings survive, and it's this question of how long they need to survive that's really something that we should address. And that really means that you use materials and building technologies in the right combinations to ensure that you consume less to build, but you also ensure that buildings survive and are occupiable and are also the inhabitants feel that sense of comfort without being exposed to this sort of rapid decay over a period of time. And I think this is where we're a little conflicted. For example, we are using concrete, and we find that to be perhaps the cheapest material or the cheapest construction technology that we could look at for rapid construction. Also because it's easily deployable and there's ease with which you can use labor for. And we use that in combination with a material that maybe is very rudimentary to create space and to create buildings. But I'm not. It's because it's important that we find that combination and ensure that it is we find the right kind of balance in the way we construct, and also we find the right balance in the way the sort of project pans out over a certain period of time. So I think, yeah, this is something we're trying to solve. We're at both ends of the scale right now, and I think will give us some answers maybe in due course. We are also trying to educate our clients to consume less and look at alternative forms of building materials and so on. It's not an easy task. Sustainability for an urban practice will happen when I think all the stakeholders are sort of aligned. Of course, we have the larger responsibility, but I think it's also important that we're able to impress upon our clients and our team members and our construction teams and our project management teams that there's a certain method and a certain kind of rigor that you have to put in place to achieve this. And I think that'll take us some time.
The last project of the day for you, Villa Views. So the Villa Views location is on a sea-facing cliff offering a very unique panoramic views. Could you describe on how the positioning of the core enhances these views and contributes to the spatial experience throughout the villa?
So I think, what's interesting is that when we look at a sense of continuity within the office and you perfect a certain way of building, we look at ways to borrow from that. So the example here being, we spoke of Shipara and this idea that the positioning of the core becomes crucial to the way you look at the entire floor plate. And that's an idea that we were able to extend almost 10 or 11 years later into Villa Vue. Because it's a sea-facing project, creating that panorama and the vistas within the building became really the key for the project and the occupants, of course. So what we're looking at is not a very large plot. It's, I think, about 6.5 or 7,000 square feet. And the brief from the client was to look at a large garden on that plot. Now, that's a bit of a challenge because when you're looking at a house that's, I think, in excess of about 12, 13,000 square feet, it means that you end up occupying a big chunk of that land. And what we've done is actually shrunk the base as minimal as a fit as possible on that ground. And we've looked at larger floor plates above. And when you look at that diagram, it really means that you have to account for a large cantilever and allow for the core to sit within the smallest footprint. And that's what we've done. It comes from a very simple diagram, but the complication that sort of led to is that enormous cantilever of about 22 feet. And the project really becomes about engineering the project to achieve that diagram. And we've done that successfully. So everything off the core, the entire building kind of springs off that core. That's about the 22 feet, that's about a 16 feet of programmed space. That's all the living spaces, bedrooms, and so on for 2 floors. And beyond that, there are decks, balconies that you can step out onto. That's how that 22 feet cantilever is used. So what it does really is it's a completely open span column free space, and just it's also done in composite structure, so it's done in steel and concrete. We're a wonderful structural consultant, BL Manjunath, who helped us design this as well. And yeah, that's how that project is. It really works. It really feels almost like a sort of a large ship has sailed onto land and sort of parks itself there, and there are these amazing views. It's all glass in the front, so it feels like this sort of sculpted object is placed on the ground. It feels very periscopic in that sense. Everything beyond that anchored core is all floating, and it gives us a very large 22 feet garden under the building. So the underbelly, the space below the underbelly of the project, if you see the photographs, is all shaded garden space. So they sit there during cyclonic weather without being hit by rain. So yeah, I think that's how that project sort of works.
The last question for the day, Sujit. Finally, as SDEG continues to evolve and adapt to the shifting urban and cultural landscape, what What key principles or aspirations do you envision guiding the firm's future projects and impact on architecture in India and beyond?
I think one aspect that I've touched upon earlier, and is something that we talk about a lot at the office, as I mentioned a little earlier, is the first question that we ask always when we are in the team or we are sitting together is, what does the project really have to offer you? And stay away from the question of what do you have to offer the project? I think that's something that we kind of discuss a lot. And I think the other thing that we really talk about a lot is the narrative for the project. We really think, and I know a lot of architects say this, but for us, storyboarding and creating a fleshy story for the project is very important. And we don't really dive into hitting site, very quickly. There's a kind of intentional lag that we create through our conversations with the client to make sure that we've captured the best aspects and the best moments from these conversations that we can log into the project in many ways. And I think the third aspect really for us over time, because the nature of projects in the office has changed a lot. We're now 17 years into practice, and it means that now we have an extremely interesting mix of projects. On my last count, we're doing 10 different building types. So that's very interesting of all scales. We don't really shy away from an opportunity if it's really small, even if it gives us a sense of joy and purpose and a kind of excitement can hold us. We're sometimes designing just kiosks, and sometimes we're designing for, a large housing project, for example, or a large master plan. And I think the way we see ourselves is to be able to create the critical kind of learning within the office to attack and solve all kinds of projects and not be kind of stuck with any one project type. Stuck is a strong word, but to kind of say that you're aligned to only one kind of thinking or a certain kind of project scale. So I think that's something that we're really looking forward to. We're building that knowledge base, and we're building the expertise within the office. We're building teams like that within the office now, where certain teams are handling certain kinds of certain scales of projects, and certain teams are actually only crafting projects. So I like this idea that projects go through the cycle of concept, and they go into kind of development, and then they go into kind of, working drawing documentation, and there's another team that kind of handles it at site. I like that conduit, and I'm trying to very hard to build that stream and kind of build that pipeline so that projects move through a certain trajectory before they hit site. And we're building the teams that can help us do this. I can't say I'm doing it by myself. Increasingly, in fact, I'm realizing that our team has gotten so strong that they're able to resolve and kind of work through projects even without so much of my assistance. And it means that the office is building that, it means that after 17 years, an office must be mature enough to be able to create projects of a high standard, even without the personalities within the office driving them. I'm a big believer in that, and I think we'll build up towards that even more as we go along. But we're on our way, I think, in many ways. I feel like we're I remember our first and second year as clearly as I do yesterday, and we still retain that same exuberance and energy within the office today.
So that was the last question for the day, Sujit. Thank you so much for giving your precious time. It was a pleasure to have you here, and don't forget to sign up on the Fublis website. Thank you so much.